God, open your word to our hearts, and our hearts to your word. And give us grace to receive it, to understand it, and to obey it, for the glory of Christ our Lord. Amen. Please be seated. So words from Mark's Gospel, chapter 1 and verse 27. Mark tells us that they were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." I want to begin this morning by saying to you that disruption is not always a bad thing. Disruption is not always a bad thing. Disruption, even in the midst of the life of a worshiping community, should not always be perceived negatively. In fact, oftentimes when there is disruption within the midst of the worshiping community, a community which is always in the palm of God's providential hands, there are two important questions, I believe, which the church is being challenged to ask in the midst of that disruption. First is, what is God doing in the midst of this disruption? What is God up to? And secondly, how are we therefore being challenged to see him more clearly, and therefore be more faithfully the people that God is calling us to be? What is God doing in the midst of this disruption? And how are we being challenged to see him more clearly and be more faithfully the people that he calls us to be? Our gospel passage for today picks up where we left off last week with Jesus' calling, his invitation to his first disciples to come and follow him, with the promise that he would make them fish for people. And this passage itself follows from the gospel reading the week before, when we read and heard about Jesus' own baptism in the Jordan. And so in today's passage, as we follow the course of Jesus' life, Jesus has gone now to Capernaum. He's been baptized, he's called his first disciples, and now he's in Capernaum. And there he enters one of the local synagogues in order to teach the people. And we are told that the people are amazed at his teaching and the authority with which he taught. For he taught them not like their own teachers. It was so strikingly different from their usual teachers, the scribes. So Mark says that just then, there is a disruption in the synagogue. There is a disruption in the synagogue. A man with an unclean spirit cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." So Mark goes on to tell us that Jesus simply rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." The unclean spirit, convulsing this man and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. Now this disruption in the synagogue is no doubt an extraordinary exchange. You don't see it all the time. But it is an extraordinary exchange in which we see God authoritatively at work in the midst of this synagogue, in the midst of the church, if you will. And we see those who witness this exchange, therefore being challenged to see God more clearly, and to understand, to consider and understand the implications of his authority, this authority with which he acts, to understand the implication for their own lives not for their neighbors, not for the one down the street, but for them. So Jesus, starting out in his earthly ministry, walks into the synagogue as a relatively unknown individual. He teaches the people with an undeniable authority. He casts out an unclean spirit of a man who was present there. And the people, in their amazement, keep on asking the question, asking one another, what is this? What is going on here? What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, they say. And they obey him. And as Mark recounts this disruption, it is important for us to recognize that his focus, Mark's focus in writing this passage and relaying this to us, his focus is not on the exorcism. It is not on this tremendous deliverance, this healing which has just taken place. We do not know this man's name. We do not know where he came from. We do not know how he came to be in the synagogue, how he felt after he was healed, where he went after he was healed. None of it. Mark is concerned to point us beyond the miracle. He is concerned to point us beyond the miracle itself, to ask the more important questions. Who is this who is able to do such things? For if we have all witnessed what has just happened, then what do these events mean? What do they mean for us? What is going on here? What is God doing? But you see, it was not just about the fact that this man was healed. I'm sure that there are persons who were healed from various sources of power and authority all over the place. But it was the authority with which this was done. Jesus simply commanded the spirit to be silent and come out of him. And the unclean spirit came out of this man. And so in the midst of this disruption, just picture it in your minds for the moment. In the midst of this disruption, the irony is that even if those in the synagogue were left wondering, what is this all about? What is going on here? Who is it that can act with this kind of authority? What do these events mean? If they were left wondering amongst themselves, the demons certainly knew what was going on. They knew what was happening. They recognized who Jesus was right away. And they obeyed. They obeyed. So Mark tells us that word about what Jesus said and about what he had done in the synagogue that day began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. And we would think that when such a phenomenal event happens, it would be good news, that there would be those who are running to come to faith. But my friends, the events of Good Friday, which we will mark once more in a few short weeks, should be a constant reminder to all of us that the wholeness of body and mind and spirit to which God calls all humanity, not just us, the wholeness of body, mind, and spirit to which God calls all humanity, and the way in which the example of Jesus' own life would come to challenge us to think about the goodness or badness of human character. Everything has been recalibrated. But all these things, all these events, should challenge us to remember that the world will not always welcome this wholeness with open arms. They don't want it. Unless we think that the world is somehow out there, and we who are in here are somehow not a part of that world, let me remind you that the world, in the sense in which it is being used here, has left its stain on each and every one of us. That division between being of the world and not being of the world, it runs right down the middle of every single one of us. It infects our thoughts, it infects our words, it infects our deeds, it infects our attitudes. All of the ways through which we reject Jesus' prophetic authority over us. And let us not forget that, right, it was the religious leaders whom Jesus often came into confrontation with. It was the insiders, if you will. They were the ones who were jealous of Jesus' popularity among the people. They were the ones who looked down upon his heritage with scorn. Oh, this is the son of the carpenter from Nazareth. We don't have any prophets who come from there. Check the scriptures for yourself. They were the ones who hated the fact that he went around healing on the Sabbath day. Disruption. Pay attention, please. Didn't do that. It was not planned, Joel. We didn't plan this, right? Right? They were the ones who hated the fact that this Jesus went around and healed on the Sabbath day, that he forgave the sins of others who had sinned against God, and he said, "You are forgiven." They absolutely detested the fact that the wholeness of body and mind and spirit to which he called them entailed pointing out their hypocrisies, pointing out their sin. They were the insiders, if you will. And they were willing to recognize that, yeah, this Jesus was one who certainly taught with an undeniable authority. But they were unwilling to recognize and acknowledge his authority over them. Yes, he's authoritative, but not for them. But my friends, what happens when in the midst of these disruptive moments, which inevitably enter our lives, enters our Christian community? What happens when our questions turn to prayers? When we say, "Lord, how are you at work in the midst of this disruption? How are you inviting me to see you more clearly? How are you drawing me day by day and moment by moment to be more faithfully the person that you have called and equipped me to be?" I believe that when these become the kinds of questions that we prayerfully ask, that we have already begun to position ourselves perfectly under the authority of God, in order that we may be enabled to see, enabled to understand, enabled to see him more clearly, and truly begin to wrestle with the implications of his mission and the message that he came to bring, not over our neighbor's life, but the implications for our own lives. In other words, these disruptive moments, when there are changes or disturbances to what might otherwise have continued as business as usual in our lives, and in particular in our spiritual lives, when these disruptions come, these are moments in which God is drawing us and inviting us to come to know, to come closer, to come and to see, to taste and to see. And I don't know if it's the same for you, but it has been my experience that after I've gotten to know any particular individual for a period of time, somehow they begin to look differently to me, right? They begin to look differently from how I would have remembered them in that, right? When you go back in your mind's eye and you remember that first meeting, they begin to look different. And it is not so much that their physical features have actually changed, but rather the more familiar I have become, the more familiar they have become to me, I literally begin to see them differently. I begin to perceive them differently. It is the sense in which this one who was once a stranger has now become a familiar friend. And I believe that it is something like this toward which Mark is pointing us in the way that he tells us about this exorcism, this man with this unclean spirit. Mark is writing so that we may come and meet this Jesus. And meet him in a way that he will no longer be a stranger, but that he will be a familiar friend. He is pointing us to the God whom we must get to know, not on our terms, but on God's own terms. And to move beyond the myriad of preconceived notions about God which we often bring to the table, even without recognizing it sometimes. But in this God, you and I are being invited to see that his use of authority, his use of power over us is always for our good. Always for our good. It is for our healing. It is for our wholeness of body and mind and spirit. He is not here to destroy us, but he is here to save us. And in his very life is rooted the authority to dispel from our lives all that is not of him. All that seeks to draw us away from the love of God and from God's good desires for his human creatures. So Mark is inviting us to come and meet this God who is bidding us, who is commanding us to be free of all of those lesser spirits which seek to cause division or confusion or discord. He's inviting us to come and to be free from those lesser spirits which tempt us to puff up ourselves because of some knowledge that we think we have over and above what someone else has. He's inviting us to come and to be free of those lesser spirits which tempt us to misuse whatever power or authority we may have for our own purposes and not for God. He's inviting us to come, to be free from those lesser spirits which entice us to treat one another worse than we would want to be treated ourselves. Be free. You see, this God who continues to be present with us and present among us commands us to be free from these lesser spirits. Because you know what? They no longer have power and authority over us. They don't. Let them go. He's commanding us to come to him. And as John reminds us, whom the Son has set free, free indeed. You know it. Free indeed. Will we listen to the command that he gives? The demons heard it and obeyed. What about us? Mark writes, they were all amazed. And they kept on asking one another, who is this? A new teaching with authority.